Yeah. Good afternoon again, and thanks again for that opportunity. I will talk about what I see as the legacy of the international community after more than 10 years of engagement in Afghanistan. And I will start, and also you said you were exaggerating a little bit. Of course, I cannot speak about everything in Afghanistan very seriously, and that's why also I hope you will apologize that I'm using my notes here a little bit on this computer so that I don't forget anything, because sometimes being too long in a country also means that you cannot concentrate really on one topic. I think what is very important in your introductory remarks is that we in Europe or the West more in general very often see Afghanistan just through the lens of security, of war and conflict. And of course, the issues are much broader, and also the issue of security is much broader. It does not only cover the military side of things, or what I would call the physical security of Afghans, which is the most important issue, but it also covers what usually is called human security, which has much to do with social services, how people live, to which services they have access, and actually the level of life they are enjoying. And I think this was a major issue, at least in the beginning, when the international community intervened in Afghanistan during the Taliban days and ending the regime of the Taliban, which rightly was criticized for not taking too much care about its own population, not providing basic services, excluding half of the population, the female part of the population, from many social fields, and leaving the rest what needed to be done to international organizations like the United Nations and its specialized organizations, also to NGOs, which continued working in those days under quite difficult circumstances. And that was not always appreciated by the Taliban. They even made life for them more difficult very often. So let me be a little bit different from when media talk about Afghanistan. I'm not starting to talk about the war and our troops and what will happen after 2014. I leave that for the end of my presentation, do it very briefly, and then probably we can also come back to it during the commentary session and questions and answers. It's also important to look at that side of the human security side of things, because when we look at the military, I mean, the military mission in Afghanistan, which will change in 2014, at the end of 2014, is still called ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force, which actually meant that our troops were in Afghanistan not to fight a war, although the US government and then our governments, very often following them, reinterpreted it that way, but it actually was to set up a framework of security for Afghans, for the Afghan government, but also for the Afghan population, in which issues of human security, namely education, health, and whatever else belongs to it, will be secured, so that we help to set up that framework and that Afghans do the rest of the work themselves. But that very quickly changed, and today not much of the first part, unfortunately, has been left. So what's important is, let's just check some facts, what has happened in this field over the past 11 plus years in Afghanistan. And I also want to point out that one of the problems I'm seeing in the moment when the disengagement process is underway, the transition process in Afghanistan, as it is officially called, we have that tendency that our governments become more and more positive about Afghanistan, because they're trying to sell their policy, which when you are in the field doesn't look too overly impressive. Of course, there was progress in Afghanistan, not unsubstantial, but there are also a lot of what usually in a euphemistical way is called challenges. There are a lot of really big problems, and problems no one knows how to deal with them. So I also would like to say that when we listen to our governments, we always should take it with a pinch of salt and really check reality and do not believe everything they're telling us. Usually when progress in Afghanistan is described also in the social field, in the field of human security, you come to education and you hear figures like that now 7 million young people in Afghanistan are attending schools, that about 1/3 of them are girls, that there is an enormous increase of students in higher education institutions, universities, etc., that the health services have improved so much that around 80% of the population are now covered by health services. But the definition of coverage is that everyone who lives within 2 hours distance from a health facility is covered, which is quite a long way in Afghanistan, especially when you're living under war conditions in many areas. Just imagine here you need to walk 2 kilometers to the 2 hours to the next health facility. You probably would almost half be out of Catalonia. Afghanistan is a very mountainous country, so it's difficult. Other progress which is often cited is that there are better laws. There's a very good constitution in Afghanistan which provides equal rights to both sexes, that there has been economic growth of an average of 9% over the last 10 years or so, that the per capita income of Afghans have grown 5-fold when you compare it with the years of the Taliban, that now that energy supply to the Afghan population has grown by 250%, and that on the UN list of the Human Development Index, Afghanistan made it from position 192, which was, I think, the 3rd or 4th from bottom, now to 155, which is also a substantial step forward. But I see a lot of buts. One of the buts is, of course, that the point of comparison, or the point of reference, is the Taliban time. And I would say it's pretty easy to be better than the Taliban on issues of social services. Of course, it's good when it's going forward, but when we look at it, that the international community has pledged $60 billion to Afghanistan over the past 10 or 11 years, we also have to ask how effectively has it been used. I will come to that a little bit later. And we need to ask whether the money really has been used effectively and the investment has been made available to Afghans. My second point would be, if we look at this progress, very often it is put into quantitative terms. So 7 million students, of course, is much better than, I don't know, 500,000 who attended schools under the Taliban. That doesn't say anything about quality. How good is the education? How good are these health facilities which are 2 hours far away from you? Are there doctors? Are there nurses? Is there medication? And people who live in Afghanistan know that in many places they are not, because, again, there's a war situation. Doctors and teachers and nurses don't want to work in these areas, and actually they cannot work there. There are no facilities for their families, there are no facilities for children, and they are under constant threat, not only from one side. Very often we hear reports that schools and also health facilities are just occupied by one of the 2 major warring sides. We have a number of reports that US troops just use health facilities or schools as temporary headquarters during military occupations, and we also know that the Taliban don't give too much of a damn to whether doctors and whether doctors should be neutral and use these facilities to start attacks on their enemies. They also use schools, they use civilian houses and fire from them, and when then the Western forces fire back and kill some people, there's a big problem about civilian casualties, which is of course a big problem, but it's very often it's a bit more complicated than just black and white. When we look into education, also the question is what is taught at schools. We just had that controversy about Afghanistan, that new textbooks had been delivered to schools, which in the field of history just leave out the last 30 years. It's too controversial. No one wants to touch it because there are so many different actors involved that no one wants to step on this very touchy territory, so they just leave it away. But of course, I mean, most of Afghans know what has happened in the past 30 years, and they know what that there was something, and that you cannot just leave it out of teaching. Then one development which I see, which is rather recent in Afghanistan, is that there's a growing split between private education and then government education. So a lot of private universities are popping up, private institutions of teaching, which pay a lot more money than governmental universities and higher education institutions, and which just draw away the best teachers from the state-run universities. So a social gap is actually coming into being, where the people who can pay for education go to private schools and universities and get better education, while a large part of the population is not able to access education of certain quality. And especially our Afghan friends who are sitting here know exactly what is taught in schools and how it is taught in schools, and most of the universities is just no modern ways of teaching. It's still what the Afghans call dictate. So you dictate the text to people, even to students at university, and they will write it down and then learn it by heart at home, and will repeat it at the examinations, and afterwards they very soon will forget it. I mean, in this field there's really not much progress. So the quantity, the number of students, number of schools is only one side of what we look upon. The third point I want to make is that also these achievements, which are without doubt existing, are tending to be undermined in the current political climate, which has been characterized by this transition process, by the disengagement of the international community from Afghanistan, and also by a security situation which is still very bad. I will come back to that also a little bit later, which just makes it very difficult for many communities in the more outlying areas actually to access these existing health and educational facilities, because it's just too dangerous to send the kids to school when they run the risk in running into a military fight between whomever is engaged there. And we see that the first victims of access getting more difficult are women, because the male part of the population would not send them to the clinics anymore. Very often they also insist that there should be female personnel, and that's even a bigger problem. And also the children are not sent to school anymore. So, I mean, this is eroding. And when we hear these figures of 7 million or 8 million students, I'm hearing them since 4 or 5 years, and I just basically do not believe them anymore. And I'm not sure how actually these things are counted. So we need to be a little bit more critical towards these things. The fourth point is sustainability of these institutions. Still, according to the World Bank, 96% of Afghanistan's revenues come from external sources. When we now see that foreign actors are already decreasing their input in development aid and other things. For instance, the biggest donor is the US, of course. US Aid is the organization doing it. They have cut down their budget for Afghanistan from 2010 to 2011. At the last figures we have, from 4.1 billion to 2.5. That's almost decreasing it to 50%, or let's say 60% or so. And of course that has big repercussions. 96% external sources, and also the cost for the Afghan army and police, which is believed to be 4.1 billion per year after 2014. That's exactly as much as what the whole Afghan governmental budget is. So if you want to keep your army and your police up without external resources, you actually would have to spend all your budget. So what do you pay hospitals and health clinics and schools from? Of course, there are commitments by the international community to continue spending also for the Afghan National Security Forces for after 2014. But we know ourselves how our how our governments are working. I mean, no government can make really 100% commitment for after 2014, because in most of our countries the parliaments will decide about the budget of next year. And I mean, particularly in Spain, you know that very well, but also in other countries, we are in an economic crisis. Budgets are cut down, and the first budget, which usually is cut down, is the budget for development aid. So will we really be able to stick to the promises, to continue financing the army and the police, which, as you say, actually is not the backbone of a society, or not the only one at least, and who will continue paying for education and health services, ASDHA or AAN? I mean, we're a little bit small for that, so I mean, we really need to make sure that this is happening. One could point out and say now that, for instance, the European Union, also the German government, has said we will continue to keep the development aid level on the level which is the current one. But again, it's all under a question mark of a parliamentary decision in the future. Another point which is also interesting is when we look at economic growth and at these quantitative figures, it kind of just gives you the average of Afghan society. And one thing which we very clearly see when we live and work in Afghanistan is that the social gap has really increased in Afghanistan. There's a small group of people who have become extremely rich, also thanks to the input of external resources, while a large part of the population really has to fight to survive, not so much in a physical way, but in a sense of human security. I mean, rents and commodity prices and have increased so much that many people cannot afford to live in Kabul anymore. But we also have seen an influx from more dangerous provinces into the capital over the past few years. So, I mean, these people are really between the devil and the deep blue sea. So economic growth rates are not the only yardstick we should use. And actually, very interestingly, the Afghan foreign minister, Dr. Rasul, has said the same thing at the UN conference recently in Rio de Janeiro. I think it was the Rio +10 conference about, what was the conference called? About, the Rio conference on sustainability, etc. And he said, actually, we should look at other figures. So, under the line, what has really changed in Afghanistan in the last 10 years with an investment of around $60 billion US, probably the biggest amount of money which ever went into a single country since the Marshall Plan in post-World War II Europe, is that Afghanistan is still one of the least developed countries in the world. Of the 26.5 people living in Afghanistan, at least according to Afghanistan's own Central Statistics Office, but the last census we had was in the middle of the 1970s and it was never completed, so we're actually not sure even about how many people live there. According to UN figures and Afghan government figures, there's 7.4 million people who are malnourished in Afghanistan, who have not access to sufficient food permanently, and there are another 8.5 million who are threatened by that problem, which makes around 2/3 of the Afghan population still living in very dire conditions. And we have 27% of the population only who has access to safe drinking water. And the lack of safe drinking water means sickness and disease and children dying, and Afghanistan still has one of the highest children mortality rates in Afghanistan. And actually, when we look at it, the number of people dying from this kind of lack of social facilities is at least double as high as those people who are killed in the conflict. And we only have 5% of the population with access to hygienic sanitation facilities. So when we listen to Foreign Minister Rasul and not only look at economic growth rates, we should look at something which also has been set up by the United Nations, which is called the Multidimensional Poverty Index, which just not only counts economic growth and average figures. Then Afghanistan is much lower. It's still number 96 amongst 105 developing countries. And when we also figure in gender equality, Afghanistan is on the second position from the bottom. I mean, if you were very black and white and cynical, you would ask, what did that money bring about at all, which has been spent in Afghanistan over the past years. Of course, we also should not lose the relations. Of course, Afghanistan has been a very poor country in the past and is still one, and we should not compare it with our countries, of course. So we look at it in a regional context in South Asia, but when you compare major figures like that with neighboring countries like Pakistan and India, Afghanistan is still far behind, and it's even behind countries who are much worse on a social standard than Pakistan and India, like Bangladesh and Nepal. So what has been achieved from my point of view in a social context is much below what could have been achieved. And that has to do with, again, with the effectivity or effectiveness of the money spent in Afghanistan. I talked about the 60 billion influx. That's actually pledges. When our government sit at conferences, international conferences on Afghanistan and say, okay, we will give so and so much money. But there are figures collected by the World Bank which say actually of these 60 billion, only 45 billion have been paid to Afghanistan, which already is only 3/4. And then you have other figures from the World Bank which say that less than 25% of the money which actually made it in the end to Afghanistan remains in Afghanistan. The rest is flowing back for contracts for people hired, experts and whatever who are working in Afghanistan from abroad. So that according to the World Bank again, not to some leftish association like ours, or, which we are very often seen as, actually it's between 14 and 25% of the money is effectively used in Afghanistan. And because a bigger portion of the development aid, a much bigger portion of development aid is actually channeled through military installation to the PRTs, like what Spain has in one of the Afghan provinces in Badghis, or what Germany had in Kunduz, or what the Americans have in many provinces. Actually, 97% of the development money is channeled through military institutions. Military, so-called military development aid even has a lower percentage of effectiveness, and it's around 14%, again, according to the World Bank. So that also explains a lot of why the impact of all what we are reading here in our newspapers has not been as impressive as it should have been with that amount of money. I'm not sure how I'm in the time, but let me just say a few sentences now about the military and security situation in Afghanistan, because it usually is neglected, or it's not, I mean, usually the human security side of it is neglected, but this is of course still important enough. What we have to say is that Afghanistan, according to institutes who do peace research, is amongst the most violent conflicts in the world. The level of violence inflicted by all sides of the conflict, which includes the Western troops, which includes Afghan national security forces and also the Taliban, is on the highest level since the start of the international mission in Afghanistan in 2001. Between 2010, 2011 and 2012, that's the figures we have, the level has remained more or less stable. Figures also are not very reliable. For instance, ISAF headquarters in Kabul, so the international forces in Kabul, say that last year actually there was a decrease of violence by 1%, which is not very much and statistically insignificant. At the same time, the US Department of Defense Ministry says it has actually increased by 6%. That's quite a margin of difference. But what is important is not so much the percentages, is to say that the level of violence now has never been higher in Afghanistan. And when we talk about provision of security only in the military sense, in the physical sense, I think not really much has been achieved. And we really need to go very deeply into the political context. We will hear about that tomorrow from Ambassador Van Drell and other people, and I'm sure they will come to that, so I just leave it out in the moment. The situation is, as I said, when I was talking about access to social services in Afghanistan, is that this level of violence, of course, has an impact on lives of people. It just makes it impossible for many of them to use the progress which has been made in Afghanistan over the past years, and it's undermining it. And even this gap which exists between how they perceive the situation in reality on the ground in Afghanistan and what is officially said by our governments, by NATO, by ISAF, creates that feeling of insecurity amongst Afghans. First, are our international partners telling the truth? Are they giving us the full picture of the situation? And do they really understand what our problems are? And they develop doubts also which then play out in other fields of the equation or in other parts of the equation in Afghanistan. When it, for instance, comes to a search for a political settlement. You all heard about the discussions about talking with the Taliban and reaching a political settlement, and then lots of Afghans saying, should we actually talk to the Taliban? Will that not mean that much of the progress might be sacrificed, that human rights, women's rights will be thrown out of the window just for the sake of a political solution, which are all valid questions. But what is also very important is that psychological impact. When they cannot trust our analysis about their own country, how can they trust the political strategy which is developed? And one of the major points we will hear about that tomorrow is that our countries just have decided that we will pull out most of our troops by the end of 2014, and we have forgotten what we said in the beginning, that we only will pull out these troops. It's about the combat troops. I will just say about that a little bit more in a moment. Without any conditions. In the beginning, when it was decided at the NATO summit, I think it was in 2010 in Lisbon, it was said we will withdraw the combat troops only when the situation is ripe in Afghanistan. But what I just said is that there's that big gap between reporting and the reality. Our governments now say, yes, the situation has improved, the Afghan forces are ready to take over, but when you go into the country, you see that in many places it's not the case. In the moment, we have that tendency that the Taliban are taking over a lot of the provinces which are not so much in the center of the country or in the center of attention, but more in the periphery, and actually trying to play that waiting game. Wait until the NATO troops are out of the country, and then they might try to probe the Afghan security forces whether they are able to defend their country. And for me, this is still an open question. So last remark. What will happen after 2014? That was your question in the beginning. Will there still be troops or not? Frankly speaking, no one really knows. It looks as if, it has been decided that the ISAF mission will end in the end of 2014, but there will be a new NATO mission, which was supposed to be a mission to train the Afghan security forces and to mentor them and so on. And that was initially planned to be in the scope of probably 15, 20, 30,000 people. But you all might have heard about these so-called green on blue attacks, which are attacks of Afghan soldiers and policemen on trainers from our countries. I think also Spanish soldiers have been killed during that. We had a few German casualties, but most of them Americans, British, Canadians, and so on, also Italians. And we had, I think, over 50 cases of that in last year, killing around 70 people. And that really has impacted the planning for the next NATO mission in Afghanistan. And the decision seems to be that there will be not as many trainers, by far not as many trainers as initially planned, that they just will be in some provincial centers on a very central, high level without being in the field, which was actually meant to be also an encouragement for the Afghan security forces so that they see, okay, our international allies do not abandon us. But that plan looks as if it has been scrapped. The training mission will not be a training mission. There's apparently a new name, which is called Resolute Support or something like that. But it looks as if there will probably be just a few thousand trainers, and there will also be a mission of what's called Special Operations Forces, which are special forces from different NATO countries who will keep up a part of the fight against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, but actually on a much lower level than now, and that will mean that these troops will not be able to work in the provinces in Afghanistan anymore. And many people just see that this might create a vacuum in which the Taliban come in. And then again, it comes to how good will be the Afghan National Security Forces after 2014 on their own. And this is not just a matter of quantity. I mean, they're up to over 300,000 by now, soldiers and police together. But even the new Afghan Interior Minister, when he took over his position a couple of months ago, said that we have problems with factionalism. Soldiers and policemen are not loyal to the central government. They're loyal to their commanders, which very often belong to different factions from the former civil war. So there's a lot of question about whether there will be cohesion in the Afghan National Security Forces. And we have the first signs that in places where Western troops have withdrawn from police and army units of Afghanistan. I mean, these are few cases. We cannot have a full picture yet, but it shows that there's a danger, and it have made agreements with the Taliban. I mean, there's selling of weapons and of other equipment, and probably if they think that their government will not survive, they also might think twice about for whom they will fight in the future. And these problems need to be faced. I know that that's my last remark, that our Afghan friends who are here very often say to us, you always see these things in a very dark light. I think it's our responsibility as analysts to say what we're really seeing on the country, and not be politicians and say what we want to see. Because if you don't see the problems, if you don't face them, you will not be able to solve them, and the first thing is to put them on the table. That's why I'm doing that. For me, it's, as you said, I've lived many years in Afghanistan. It's very, very painful to talk about these things, but I want to see our young Afghan friends being able to live a peaceful future. And there are still many obstacles in that way. And if we decide to go home, if we pull out our soldiers and our attention from Afghanistan, in the larger population, also in the political process, and it might happen that the problems which remain unsolved might lead to a situation which at least is not better than now, and now it's already bad enough. Thank you very much.
No sé si Thomas podria comentar què suposa la presència d'aquesta policia local i també la intervenció de forces especials nord-americanes, què està suposant, no? És a dir, quin és el paper que les forces especials nord-americanes estan fent a l'Afganistan en l'actualitat?
Yeah. That's one of the issues which I also wanted to come to, because I think that's one of the crucial problems in the moment in Afghanistan. I call Afghan local police, ALP, a militia. Militias are usually forces which are not under the direct control of the government. Actually, it has been invented indeed by the U.S. Special Forces, and ALP is actually an outcome that they don't trust the official security forces, and it's a shortcut to fight against the Taliban in some areas where there's a lack of national security forces. The problem is that many of these Afghan local police units, and according to what I've heard, there are in the moment 14,000 of these people deployed in 78 of Afghanistan's districts. Afghanistan has around 400 districts, so let's say in 1/5 of the districts. That these are very often former militias, sometimes even former Taliban groups who have, for this or that reason, changed sides and are used to fight their former brothers on the other side. The problem there is loyalty to a large extent, because it's even more than in the official security forces, that they just listen to their commander and will follow him wherever he decides to go. There's also a historical side of it. I mean, it's not the first time that militias in Afghanistan have been invented to help the government fight. Actually, the first time it happened in a large scale was in the government which was supported by the Soviets in the 1980s. They had a couple of 100,000 of these groups. in order to, as they called it, to defend the revolution. The revolution is long over since now, but some of these militias which had been founded in the 1980s are still existing. And some of them belong to the largest and most violent groups we're facing in Afghanistan. I mean, some people of you might have heard the name of General Dostum, who's one of the major political and military leaders in Afghanistan, former warlord in northern Afghanistan, who was actually also involved in the last election campaign of President Karzai, mobilizing his ethnic group in the north, the Uzbeks. This gentleman started as the head of a small militia which was guarding the natural gas fields in northern Afghanistan with a couple of dozen of people. And because his militia was funded, it grew and grew and grew, and it's still existing. I am afraid, and also many Afghans I'm talking to are afraid that just the same will happen, that today militias are formed, Afghan local police, that on paper it all looks very well because they are supposed to be mentored by US and other special forces. I only know that also the Germans have a role in Kunduz province and having set up some ALP units. That the recruitment is done through local elders. They have to certify that these people are okay and not helping the Taliban and so on. But it's very easy actually to manipulate that. In the beginning also it was supposed to be only 10,000 people, which is already enough, but now we're already at 14,000. The Afghan government now has decided to have more of Afghan local police and pushed it up onto 30,000. And last night I read on the internet that the commander of the US Special Forces in Afghanistan, General McRaven, has just proposed to put another 15,000 on top of Afghan local police to make it 45,000. The thing is that with the withdrawal of most of the troops also, I mean, there are not enough people from the Western forces actually really to be together with them and mentor them and at least try to prevent violations which have become more the rule than the exception by ALP. If you want to look at our website, we have a couple of reports from Kunduz province and from some others where local people start complaining. And I remember a quote from a village elder who said that actually the Afghan local police is worse than the Taliban, which has to do with the fact that very often they come first from the old Civil War militias, but very often they're also recruited on an ethnic basis. And Badriz is a little bit, where the Spanish troops are, is a little bit like that, but Kunduz is a very striking example for that, with a very mixed ethnic population. And when you recruit an ALP group in one village, which is, let's say, Tajik, they very often, when they don't get money, which very often happens because the Afghan government is usually short of funding, and those groups, including also the official army and police, very often are not paid. So these people have to survive, and then the means of survival, which has been developed over the past 30 years, is you just go to the next village and tax the people. Just take money. I mean, you could also call it looting, and this is happening in many, many cases. There was a report by US Marines who are responsible for mentoring the Afghan local police, which has been leaked to the press. It was not meant to be public. And in that report it's written that the Afghan local, it's from late last year, autumn, probably October, November or so, that the presence of the Afghan local police has not improved the security situation in a single of these districts where they are working, and that they have plenty of complaints by the local population about violation, collection of illegal taxes, rape, killings, and also ALP units starting to fight with each other. So for me, this is a recipe for disaster, and now that people sitting somewhere decide actually to let it grow even further, it really creates big concerns as far as I look at it. And I think the right way would be to put the resources which are available for these kind of militias into the legitimate Afghan national security forces and improve their quality. Very often we also see, last sentence, is that ALP are much better equipped than the normal Afghan police and army. I mean, they get armored cars which they can use, like what our forces have to, which is called force protection, so that they're not so easily be killed. While the Afghan police is driving around with very old cars which have not any armor. And I have talked to police people in provinces who said, I mean, how can I send my policemen out to fight when they're killed with the first shot, while these guys, these illegal guys or the non-official guys are driving around with much better equipment than what we have. And this is still the case. Equipment of the Afghan army and the Afghan national police is not up to the standards, and that's why also you hear a lot of complaints from the Afghan government, also when Karzai was in the US, demanding that better equipment is coming. I mean, if these people are supposed to fight, they also need to have the equipment they need, at least on the ground.
Quan sento parlar d'aquest Afganistan actual, a mi em cau l'ànima als peus perquè verdaderament fa 45 anys que vaig arribar a l'Afganistan, el 1968, en comptes d'anar a parar a París, vaig anar a parar a l'Afganistan perquè ja es podia triar cap a on anaves en aquella època i vaig viure una època de la monarquia, vaig viure el cop d'estat de Daoud Khan. Jo formava part d'unes famílies paixtuns de la branca Mohammad Zahir i vivia amb ells i vaig viure molt de prop tot aquest canvi que hi va haver en el moment en què va caure la monarquia, en què es va formar la república i en què van començar els governs comunistes. Vaig estar a l'Afganistan fins a l'any 1977 i just abans que matessin a Daoud Khan. Després no hi he tornat mai més, però he estat en relació molt directa amb la diàspora, amb la gent que va marxar del país en aquella època. Jo penso que l'equilibri que hi havia en aquell moment tribal, jo veia a les cases on vivia, clar, els paixtuns eren els que manaven i els rics, els seus criats eren els hazares, els tadjics jo no em veia perquè no es tractaven amb la gent que jo tractava. Però sí que vaig veure que quan tots aquests amics meus van anar a parar a la presó, quan van arribar els soviètics, es van salvar la vida perquè els seus criats hazares els hi portaven menjar i els protegien. Volia dir que hi havia unes lealtats molt ben imbricades en aquella societat i que per això aquell equilibri es mantenia. Això, en aquella època, tothom era fill d'algú i net d'algú. Un podia saber qui era una persona perquè tenia un pare i tenia un avi i un lloc on vivia i un lloc on pertanyia. Això em fa l'efecte que s'ha perdut, s'ha trencat, se n'ha anat a Norris i ara és un batibull que ningú sap qui és. A mi m'agradaria saber i demanar tota aquesta diàspora afganesa que ha sortit fora i que molts d'ells són persones ben situades a l'estranger, són metges i són professionals importants, quin paper juguen en aquesta transició?
Yeah, thank you very much. First, I have to say that I'm really jealous because when I came to Afghanistan for the first time in the 1980s, the war had already started. So I've never seen it in peace. I hope that one day it will happen. Not too far from today. When I listen to stories from these days, and last night I found a couple of pictures from the 1960s done by some American people who worked there in education, and very nice photos, a long series, Denver Post, if you want to open that website, quite interesting. For me, always the point which comes to mind is it shows that Afghanistan can be peaceful and can be at least quiet. And there were 40 years of peace in Afghanistan between 33 and 73 when the coup d'etat happened. Of course, we also should not idealize those days, because they were definitely not without problems. You were pointing to one. There was a very strong social stratification, which also kind of had to do with ethnic groups, and people of certain groups like the Hazaras were not allowed to make career and higher positions in the state and so on. And that at least has changed by self-emancipation of these people during the war against the Soviets, when they just took their own matters in their own hands and proved that they can achieve as much. And but we very often also overestimate this ethnic dimension. I think, I mean, there is definitely ethnical mobilization going on in Afghanistan on the political side also. But when I listen to stories like when the servants saved the rich families they were working for, I think that's also, it shows that it doesn't have, or it does not necessarily have to do with ethnic groups or whatever. It's just the human dimension of people, that they help each other. I mean, that also has happened and other conflicts where people who we think should be enemies of each other helped each other. And I think there need to be that conscience that Afghanistan is not a country which is in constant state of war, that there were periods in history. I mean, we should not live in the illusion that can be reestablished, that we can go back to, I don't know, 1970, because now it's 2013, and what has happened in the last 30 years cannot be made undone. But of course, the conscience is needed, what has happened in those days. And I think in the moment, very often what is seen as ethnic and ideological, and I'm not saying that these factors do not exist, is actually about power. And it's also about bad conscience, I think. You have so many people in Afghanistan, political leaders and those people who helped them and who followed them, who actually have a bad conscience and who know very well that they committed terrible crimes in the past. And there's almost no social, political, ethnic group which has not committed crimes. And what very often is happening, oh, you killed more than I did, but that also includes admitting that, yeah, we also killed people. Probably not as much as you, but who knows? And one of the big open questions where also the international community actually has failed deeply is addressing this. Because when we, as the West, went into Afghanistan to fight the Taliban, we allied ourselves with people who now pop up in this Afghan local police or also in the official forces, and who are sitting in government, who have been politically responsible, sometimes had their hands very directly in terrible crimes. And we made them our allies, and we did not help this big part of the Afghan population to administer justice in whatever way Afghans would have chosen. And that's still an open question how that needs to be done. But it's just not so that, as what also has been just recently said in the meeting of some high-level former Mujahideen leaders, that we only have two ways. Either we do courts or we forget everything about it. No, it's not as simple as that. People do not forget, they live with this. And I think the choice of the international community, or those who actually set the course of what later then is called international community, was, okay, we work with these people, and we actually allowed them not to talk about their own crimes. And I mean, really the darkest hour of, one of the darkest hours of Afghanistan was when people sitting in the current parliament, former Mujahideen, former Taliban, there are a few, former communists, there are also a few of them, just in a big coalition decided, okay, there should be an amnesty for ourselves, and no one can do anything against it. And the international community did a few complaints. Some of them spoke out very clearly, but most of them actually signaled that, okay, there are bigger problems, and the bigger problem is the fight against the Taliban. But how can you fight people who do terrible crimes with people who have done terrible crimes? because that's just perpetuating this. And we will never break out of that cycle of violence if we do not face it. But it's not so much, I mean, we need to, that's also what I think that the role of the international community in Afghanistan should be, as I said in the beginning, when I said assisting security, it's assisting Afghans to deal with their own problems amongst themselves, but not with some people sitting on that big chair with the big guns and all the money and the money we are giving to them, and the other ones who actually are not able to look into their eyes. So what we need to do is create conditions under which all Afghan different social political groups deal with this and can deal with this on a let's say on a halfway equal basis. And that's a big failure, and that also has to do with security, because this impunity shows it can always happen again. And that's why also people are afraid now, and if the Taliban come back, they will just do whatever has been done by all the different groups. When they're in power, they will just tear apart what has been put on paper, and then we have to fight for rights again from the start, probably.
Thank you.
I did not answer the question, but that probably we can come to that later. It's getting too much.
The question which I wanted to ask, one of the questions, is that as you know that there are some changes, especially from the side of regional players, Pakistan and Iran, which are highly involved in the conflict in Afghanistan, and one can say that they are the dynamics of the conflict somehow, starting from the support of the Mujahideen and then later Taliban with the help of CIA. And you know that there are some negotiations with the Taliban from the side of Afghan government and international community. Do you think that this drama will finish before the international troops will pull out from Afghanistan? And the US is trying to be the only player in the ground in the region, and it is something that maybe US is trying to encourage others to leave the country and leave the region for the future of the region. And they want to be like the only big brother stay in the region. Do you think that it is the end of the drama, or pulling out of the international community or the international troops is still dark, and this is just they decided to go out, or this is a policy, or this is something that we don't know about?
That's very much a couple of questions. First, on the role of the regional players in the neighboring countries, Pakistan and Iran. I think that's a very important factor for the conflict, also for the perpetuation of the conflict. There's clearly very unhelpful mingling in Afghan affairs, and that's put it very mildly. But at the same time, there's also a lot of internal factors, which I just talked about, the fact of justice, and that people don't want to face what they did in the past. And I think this relationship between external and internal factors, I'm never sure which is 51% and which is 49%. Usually when I'm talking to Afghan friends, I'm saying 51% is internal. Don't talk all the time about Pakistan and Iran. I'm also not saying don't forget about it. I mean, I'm not saying forget about it. But it's also very often it's used by many political actors blaming Pakistan, or in the moment also blaming the US and everyone for everything which went wrong in Afghanistan. I mean, there are a lot of Afghans who also have a big responsibility for it, and particularly those political leaders who have been around for 3 decades. Talks with the Taliban, I don't see that there are negotiations yet. There are some contacts, there are some talks, but negotiations is really when you sit together, you have an agenda and try to find a solution. We are not there yet. I'm not sure whether it's good or bad. I would actually say it's bad, because I do not see any other way than a political solution. I also want to add that I don't think that just talking with the Taliban and probably finding some kind of agreement or deal with them is a solution. That can only be, or that must be part of the solution, but it's only probably the smaller part of it, because there are many more Afghan political and social forces who need to be brought into a political agreement. And it doesn't look as if we have that until 2014. What is really important is that now people start working on that. I mean, there are few small signs of hope. First of all, that also is in the media very often, is there are some people in the Taliban who also don't want to see their own country destroyed and think that the political way might be a way out. It's not a decision that the Taliban will go for a political settlement or something. The question is also what the political settlement would look like. Another sign is that also international players have finally bought into the idea that there needs to be a political settlement. I mean, as long as there was President Bush in the US, he said we're not talking with terrorists, full stop, and no one was able to do it. But there are also a couple of very big hurdles still. I mean, there's this constant fighting about who's actually the one who should talk to the Taliban. President Karzai just has accused the US again that they are trying to monopolize the talks with the Taliban, which of course they should not do. I'm not sure whether they're doing it in the moment. It's all not very progress that you really can say. I mean, the Afghan government clearly has to play a role, and they have been told for a long time that they should be in the lead in this process, but I also want still to see a strategy in Afghanistan, or of the Afghan government for a political settlement. I mean, when I see that they want to have the High Peace Council in a leading role, frankly speaking, and I mean, there's a camera, but anyway, I don't care. Most people in the High Peace Council are not really experts in peace. And I'm not the only one. I mean, women's organizations in Afghanistan and civil society organizations have said the same. I mean, how can you have people doing peace who are responsible for major war crimes in the past? First, they have to face this and address this, and then they probably can do it. But of course, they also need to be brought in because they are a factor. But the question is, I mean, you know, how this peace will look like. There might be a peace agreement in the end, which doesn't help too many people. So another sign of hope is that the UN, who has really been marginalized in the last few years, also under pressure of the Afghan government, who says, oh, you should not mingle into elections, you should not mingle in sub-national issues, close your offices in a lot of provinces and so on, which is not helpful because the UN is the biggest organization, has the most weight as an organization, potentially, in probably getting a process going on. And then the new relatively new special representative, Mr. Kubiš from Slovakia, who said, okay, we want to help to organize an inner Afghan dialogue, which I think has been interpreted as between the different insurgent groups, and he also had a couple of these initiatives. But if they concentrate on this dialogue within Afghanistan, between people like you, from the human rights community, and the political opposition, and the Taliban, ex, and still, and whatever, I mean, that would help. But of course, the Afghan government also needs to understand that this is important, that they cannot do everything themselves, because simply they are one party in the conflict. They cannot be the mediator and the party in the conflict at the same time. Same problem the US have. So he called it a drama. In a way, it is a drama, but the drama is also that we have not more progressed until now. I mean, I think the political process towards an agreement, a political settlement, at least of the war, ending the war, is an absolute priority. And everyone should have a say in that, and not just only the people with the guns. I mean, that's a simple principle. You can state it very easily, but it's very difficult to do it. Let me just say something about the diaspora, because I was carried away by the reminiscence of the pre-war Afghanistan. Yeah, there are many Afghans abroad. And most of them, of course, have I mean, there are different waves. Huh? I mean, there were people who left Afghanistan when there was no war because it was the business community. And many of their children have studied in the West and have citizenship now in all kinds of countries. And many of them have actually forgotten more or less about Afghanistan. But many also have always been engaged and have given money and spare time and went back to the country and did projects and supported their families and so on. And then later people who fled from the communists, people fled from the Mujahideen, people fled from the Taliban, people fled from the war now, economic migrants, you have all these different, I mean, the diaspora is probably more diverse than Afghanistan itself in a way. There were attempts to bring the professionals back in the beginning. There was the initiative of the former king when he was still alive. A lot of those people were in the first Karzai government as ministers. And what happened there was a conflict about influence between the former Mujahideen parties and their people who were in government who said, we have been in the mountains, we are fighting the Soviets, we have deserved to lead that country, and you had this comfortable life in the West, which some of them probably really had, but others did not really have. And then there were all these kind of name-calling. I mean, there was a famous thing, they called these people in the West dog washers. So actually, because there was one story that one of these Afghan exiles had a dog saloon somewhere in New York or whatever and was washing dogs, and that's a very dirty thing in the mind of some Muslims. And so that was very derogatory and also showed that we don't see these people as equal. Then also some of them came and said, oh, we are the guys who have the wisdom from the West and we show you know how to do it. Also that arrogance which was there, which was also not helpful. And then a lot of them just came and wanted to make quick money and then left again. So you have all these different movements, directions into that diaspora. But the thing is, I think from a point of view of Afghans living in the country, they just need to recognize that those people, most of them did not choose to leave, they were forced to leave, so that they also have a stake in their country. But they also should listen to the Afghans in the country, because what we often hear, as we are also talking about Afghanistan all the time, but many of our Afghan friends who lived in the diaspora have been there 30 years ago, and that was a different Afghanistan as what you just described. And you cannot start from there, you also have to learn first what's happening there. So if they can all pull together, and if they also show that they give something to the country, when they have something to give, when they live abroad, I mean, of course they should play a role. But it is also a political factor behind it, so that very often they are not allowed to do it, or they're also not much better than many of the leaders who stayed in the country. So, yeah, that's what I can say about it.